Imagine you've just come home from a stressful day, and there on the counter are those delicious sugar-free cookies staring right at you. You know they've got artificial sweeteners in them, but no harm, no foul, right? Well, not so fast. New research shows more and more how fake sugars negatively affect our gut and metabolic health, how they may be bad for our hearts, they may actually boost food cravings, and perhaps worst of all, insulin resistance, which is a condition that's a precursor to type 2 diabetes. So it begs the question, is your sweet tooth killing you? Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Jonathan Fialkow. I'm the Chief Population Health Officer for Baptist Health, and I'm your host today for today's conversation, coming to you from the Baptist Health Newsroom. The debate about artificial sweeteners has been around especially for these last several years, but now food manufacturers are packing them into breads, yogurts, muffins, salad dressings, and snack bars, just to name a few things that we might otherwise think are healthy. So here to talk to us about that, we have two experts on the Baptist Health family. I'd like to welcome Dr. Angel Alejandro, an endocrinologist with Baptist Health Medical Group. Welcome, Angel.
Hey, how are you? Thank you.
And Amy Kimberlain, who's a registered dietitian and diabetes educator at Baptist Health Miami Cardiac and Vascular Institute. Thanks, Amy, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So before we dive into today's subject, I want to remind our viewers to send in your questions and comments throughout the discussion. We're here for you and happy to answer any questions you may have. Angel, let's kick this off with you. We use the term sugars and artificial sweeteners and whatnot, and they're so prevalent in our diet, especially sugars. But can you break down what would be considered an added sugar when you see that in a food label, and what we would be considering artificial sweeteners?
Yes. So added sugar is just that. It's anything that's added to a food during processing or preparation. Think of it as you have a cup of black coffee, you're adding sugar to it, right? The sugar is not in the coffee, you're adding it to the coffee. And then we have these natural sugars that we can add. You can put honey in it, right? That's a natural sugar. You could put sucrose, that's table sugar. But then the problem is we have now these artificial sweeteners, which mimic that sweet taste and are hundreds of times more sweet than table sugar. And that's what we're concerned about. The other problem is sometimes you don't know what's in the food until you actually go and read the label. It's estimated that the average American consumes 77 grams of sugar per day, when it's only recommended 25 for women and 36 for men. And sometimes those sugars are being snuck into our diet and we don't even realize it.
So it's not necessarily you're taking sugar cubes and putting them in your drinks, but it's in a lot of foods already, and it adds up over the course of the day is what you're kind of saying.
That is correct.
So there's foods that are sugar, and we could say fruit, honey, things like that. And then there are foods where they add sugar to it because they want to make it sweet or whatever reasons. And then you articulate artificial sweeteners. So artificial sweeteners, are they all chemical compounds, or are there any natural occurring substances that could be considered artificial sweeteners?
Well, that's when you divide it into two groups. You have your artificial sweeteners that are obviously made in a lab versus your natural sweeteners, which could be found in nature. For instance, from what I understand, stevia, for example, is considered natural. That being said, the artificial sweeteners sometimes have potential side effects or complications that we're seeing more and more in animal studies, and now they're being seen in human studies as well. But that's just the main difference. Artificial is made in a lab, natural is found in nature.
Fair enough.
And Dr. Fialkow, just to add in regards to the added sugar, you guys mentioned honey, it could be molasses, it could be agave, there's so many different ones that are added and that are added in with different names. There's up to 50 different names. And so it's really identifying now with labels where there is an item to be able to see how much is added in. And so, when you think about the consumption, you alluded to the amount, Dr. Alejandro, and it's interesting because people may not know that conversion. And so 1 teaspoon is equal to 4 grams. And so that ultimate amount of added sugar, we need to know where we're getting it from and then be able to identify how much we're taking in. So that's the added sugar side. And I would be really an advocate for people as well to figure out how much artificial sweetener they may be taking in as well. They may not understand where it's at and how much they're actually taking in.
So Amy, I think you bring up a good point. I do want to actually unpack that a little bit after, which is the labels and how much information someone can get from the labels, which sometimes can fool you, or if you don't know what you're looking at, you might mistake something for being perhaps healthier or not as what it actually occurs. But going back to the original premise, we're talking about sugar intake, Amy, I'll turn it to you, especially when we're talking about diabetes, which of course sugar can be bad and have a lot of profound effects in someone who's not diabetic or not yet diabetic. So tell us a little bit about some of these terms that get thrown out there, for example, the glycemic index and glycemic load, and what they mean when people see them and why they may or perhaps may not be that important.
The first indicator, the glycemic index, is just how a food responds if it were compared in that same amount as the effect of sugar. So in response to a blood sugar, if you consume a food, how in that same amount would it respond if it were sugar, right? So you can see this variation in certain foods, and they limit it to show that it could be a low, a moderate, or a high glycemic index. The only kind of continuation that you mentioned is we have to consider how much we're consuming. So the load. Quantity really is an impactful part of the conversation, because we're not always isolating foods as well. Now, if you isolate it and you see a food and it really just makes your blood sugar go up, that could be the response of the food that you're consuming. However, we pair foods together. So now I would like to look at the meal completely. Are you combining it with lean protein? Are you also having some non-starchy vegetables, which is fiber? And that changes the makeup of the food as well. So just looking at glycemic index, how it may mimic the effect if it were just straight sugar, that's what an index is looking at. So we look at carrots sometimes and think, wow, that has a high glycemic index. It's a misnomer, because I'm not just thinking of carrots. You now have to consider how many carrots are you eating, the load. And again, there's even one added more layer that's important to consider, and that's the form of the food that we're eating. I know it to be true. People talk about potatoes all the time. Obviously, there's no good or bad foods here. It's food. However, when foods are consumed in different forms, potato chips, French fries, the most commonly form of that potato eaten, that also changes the makeup of how a blood sugar would respond as well. So the big conversation for me, quantity and quality.
So we don't eat food by itself, which is what the glycemic index would be measured. And the glycemic index, also correct me if I'm wrong, it's your glucose response to the food compared to sugar. And then it does include fructose and various other elements which can affect our metabolism. So it's not, as you're saying, the most reliable marker of how a food might impact your health. Is that
just to clarify, we may isolate a food. We may eat a piece of fruit by itself. But as to your point, fruit has fiber, it has vitamins and minerals and all those things. That makes a different impact on a blood sugar response. Yeah. I just mean if we're really consuming food together, sometimes the index alone won't be the parameter of what we need to look at and consider, right, within that blood sugar response. It's everything combined together makes an impact. And that's what I talk about with patients. Every person's different. Every person's individualized. How does that food impact you? You need to know your impact within blood sugar response.
And that's a great transition to the question I'd like to ask Angel. Angel, we know that artificial sweeteners can affect the gut microbiome and how people absorb foods, how quickly the sugar goes up, what the impact is. Perhaps that's why some people can eat a certain diet and become diabetic and others may not. Talk a little bit about what we've learned regarding how artificial sweeteners can affect our body and how it might affect one person's body different than another's.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Jonathan. This all stems back to 2014 when there was a study done in rodents where, well, let's just take a step back. What is the gut? What are we talking about the gut? We have trillions of bacteria in our gut. And we are now realizing that bacteria is essential for healthy living. And what am I talking about? Well, they looked at these rats in 2014 and they fed them 4 different artificial sweeteners, and they measured their gut flora before and they measured their gut flora after. And what they found was the flora was different. The bacteria changed. We had different populations that weren't supposed to be there. Some grew more than others. But what blew everyone away is when they did glucose loading tests on these rats, they gave them sugar and they measured their sugar in the blood. And lo and behold, all of these rats had impaired glucose tolerance. That means when they ate food, their sugars went higher than what it was supposed to. Now, rats are rats. Rats are not humans. And what everything changed recently now when they converted this study, and they did it now to include humans. And what they did was they took a very small group, and here I disappeared again. They took a very small group. Hey, I'm back. Hey.
It's good to see you.
I apologize for the lighting. But they took 120 patients, and they fed them 4 different types of artificial sweeteners. And then they did this only for 2 weeks, Jonathan, just for 2 weeks. And then they did oral glucose tolerance tests. And 2 of those sweeteners, sucralose, and there's one more that I'm forgetting right now, but sucralose and saccharin both were shown to have impaired fasting glucose. That's not good. The other thing they showed is, and they took mice that don't have any bacteria, they introduced fecal matter from those patients, and they did the oral glucose tolerance test on those mice, and they too had impaired fasting glucose. So impaired glucose tolerance. So there's something going on that we don't fully understand. And anything that affects your glucose metabolism in a negative way is not good.
So the artificial sweeteners you mentioned, saccharin and sucralose,
Correct.
Specifically in those studies, changed the bacteria in one's gut to allow for a more rapid absorption of sugars, which led to this intolerance. Is that kind of the take home?
We don't know the exact mechanism, but those 2 in particular caused the sugars to be higher after meals in patients who do not have diabetes. These are young, healthy adults. So the microbe changed so much that it affected their glucose tolerance.
So that's brilliant. And I'm going to go to Amy on a question, but I think, what I think we're hearing, or what I'm hearing as you guys are answering these questions, it's not so much the artificial sweetener is low calorie, right? Why do we go to them? Well, it's lower calorie, but the idea that by taking an artificial sweetener, not that sugar's so great, there might be these other under-recognized components of why they might not be an answer to whether it be lose weight or whatever you might achieve. It might actually hurt your health. So Amy, to that point, if we're talking about artificial sweeteners and concerns, they're not the panacea of I get sweetness and there's no consequence. What is in the label? What do you actually educate people specifically? As you mentioned, it could be 50, I think you said, different kinds of sugars that might be fooled. And sometimes a food can have 3 or 4 different kinds of sugars under different names, correct?
Correct. So when you look at a nutrition label, I think in the last few years, it's been of help because they've added a line item so you can see added sugar. Before it was just added in and we couldn't verify the amount. So now we can see how much added sugar is in a particular product. And when we're in the grocery store. So yesterday I was looking at a packaged bread with a patient, and ironically, this brand is really marketed as being healthy. It had 5 grams of added sugar per slice. He doesn't eat just one, he has 2 slices for his sandwich, and that's now 10 grams of added sugar. So again, for perspective, 4 grams is equal to 1 teaspoon. I'm not always great at math, but the amount for women and children is just 6 teaspoons of added sugar per day, which comes out to roughly the 25. It's not exactly 24, but so 25 grams of added sugar per day. For men, it's up to 9 teaspoons, which would be 36 grams. So consider this gentleman already had 10 grams within bread. And again, while we're talking about patients with diabetes, we're looking at that total carbohydrate on the nutrition label. But now within an indentation showing added sugar, he might not have considered bread to be a source of added sugar. And it's those items that you mentioned, whether it's yogurt, a salad dressing, we need to start to begin to identify where the added sugar is at and begin to start minimizing, finding different products. And that created the discussion with his patient, other breads that he could buy. I mean, he asked me which one I buy, and I joked and I said, I make it, but we don't need everything homemade. That's added sugar. Artificial sweeteners, they're not listed on the nutrition label, but yet only in the ingredient list. So it's important to know the names, as you guys mentioned, saccharin, whether it's sucralose, whether it's acetylmate potassium, whether it's, again, aspartame. All of them have the different names. It's important that you look through the ingredients. It starts with the highest amount of the ingredient and it goes in descending order. So the idea here is to identify, does this product have any artificial sweeteners? It's really, again, the only way you're going to be able to verify because they have no calories. So it wouldn't be listed within the actual nutrition label. The last item that we haven't really touched on is sugar alcohols. So sugar alcohols have also been added into ingredients to create this level of sweetness. They don't mimic sugar within the calorie, but they do allow for the sweetness factor. They're not absorbed in the gut. So as you guys were talking about that study, that's all I kept thinking of. How is that impacting our gut, our microbiome, when we're taking in these foods that we don't actually digest? They draw in more water, and the end effect is actually, it could be a loose stool, it could be gas, and it could be bloating. On the nutrition label, additionally, sugar alcohols don't have to be included. Some companies will add it on there for you to identify it. But again, in the ingredient list, it will end in OL. So xylitol, sorbitol, erythritol, malitol, all are forms of a sugar alcohol. And I would say that's your best way to kind of distinguish where your sweetener is coming from. Is it added? Is it an artificial? Or is it now the sugar alcohol, which is even an other layer we have to consider?
I always love when people get like whole wheat bread, which is darker because they add molasses to white bread. I mean, so it's just so remarkable how the food industry can fool us into thinking something's healthier when, again, it may not be. But to a couple of your comments, I think we should emphasize those sugar alcohols and the gastrointestinal effects. I've seen so many people that change from sugars to sugar alcohols, thinking again lower calorie, and they wind up having a lot of diarrhea or bloating or gas, and they don't attribute it to the food. So we do want to recognize those are not extremely well tolerated, especially in doses that might be in the foods people eat. So Amy, just as a follow-up to the artificial sweeteners and the sugars, as you talk about reading the labels and whatnot. So I guess the premise is across the board, read the labels no matter what, get a better sense of what you're putting in your food. And isn't it fair to say just, eat foods, I'm being careful how I say this because I don't want to, I don't want to make it like it's a caveat, but, the less additional chemicals and ingredients, generally you're going to be better off in a sense. Is that something you would subscribe to just in general?
I think it's understanding what's in the product that you're taking in. There's going to be additives to a certain extent or a preservative. It's an item in the supermarket that's sitting on the shelf, right? Versus it being fresh and not packaged if it's in the produce area, right? But the idea here is to kind of start to really decipher what it is that you're taking in. We started off talking about sugar-free cookies. Just because a cookie is sugar-free doesn't mean it's carbohydrate-free. So the discussion starts to come together with what's the patient's or the person that's coming to see me, what is their goal? Are they working on managing their diabetes? Are they working at cardiovascular disease and lowering cholesterol? We have to start to have those conversations and understand why somebody might be trying to gear towards something of that nature. Sugar-free on the front of the package typically will allow that, message to the consumer that has an artificial sweetener. And again, that's where you would turn the label over, look at the ingredients and be able to confirm if it has one or even two, because to Dr. Alejandro's point, it really comes down to knowing which one that you're taking in, right? Because some, again, may have different side effects. And as to the sugar alcohols, again, I think I would be honest in saying in the last few years, it's been this gamut of just throwing it into products because of not just being so much of a calorie conscious, but it's the sugar conscious because they don't contribute the same total amount.
So that goes, Angel, maybe this is the 64,000 question for this Resource Live episode. I don't think anyone's going to argue sugar is good for you. So if we're talking about, people have a sweet tooth or we want certain sweet foods, what's the school of thought that you ascribe to between, so is sugar better than artificial sweetener? Is artificial sweetener better than sugar? And how are we defining better? Safer? Better tasting? I mean, what are the misconceptions and myths we may have regarding sugar versus artificial sweeteners? And I mean by that by saying, how do you solve the problem? Well, don't eat a lot of sugar and don't eat a lot of artificial sweeteners. You don't have to worry about which one's better. So where do you come in on that, kind of concept?
Well, in a perfect world, you would try to limit both, right? You would eliminate sugars, you would eliminate the artificial sweeteners. But that's not going to happen, right? Artificial sweeteners are not healthy. I think that has to be very clear. They are not healthy. But when you have to make a decision between a soda with an artificial sweetener or a soda with regular sugar, and that patient has to make a decision, which of the two is the healthier option? Well, if it's a diabetic, obviously, I think the diet soda would be the healthier option. But once again, it's not the healthiest option. The healthiest option is water. Right, the healthiest option
absolutely
is water.
Don't drink your calories.
We have to be real, and our patients have to make decisions, and I understand them. And I think to your point, Jonathan, about the labels, I mean, sometimes patients they're overwhelmed with the labels, and I think what you said is correct, right? Less ingredients is better, right? That's a start, right? Is it perfect? No, because they may have 2 or 3 bad ingredients, and there's only 4 in total, and 3 of them are bad. But it's a start. It's a start to get them to at least look at the label and compare. Well, this one has 18 ingredients. This one only has 9. Then maybe the one with 9 might be better. And then we can do some fine tuning after that. But when it comes to artificial sweeteners and sugar, moderation I think is important for both moderation for sucrose and obviously moderation for these artificial sweeteners.
I think those are great points. Going back to the labels, I think we're all saying the same thing. We don't expect everyone to read a label with the level of expertise that the three of us may have. So general school of thought, try to keep the food simpler in its relatively most natural form. And regarding sugar and artificial sweeteners, right, it's based on the population. Ideally, we say don't drink your calories. Water is the best thing, if you're not sure or you want to be healthy. But we have not come to the conclusion that you eat sugar, you're okay. You eat artificial sweeteners, you're going to die. I think that's what, it's not absolutes. One other thing I'll just throw out there, this is something I think we're all seeing, because when we're really getting into obesity and these metabolic disorders, and we're talking about satiety, there's some studies that actually eating artificial sweeteners promotes insulin, because you think you're going to get sugar, and when there's no sugar, then the insulin makes you hungry. So it might not even be the actual activity of what the artificial sweetener does in terms of that ingredient, but how it sets you up to eat more in general. So a lot more to unpack from these issues, from these components.
And to tag on to that, I think it really creates, again, the perspective of how much somebody's taking in. Sometimes they may not identify the products that have those artificial sweeteners, and they'll be surprised at how much they're ultimately taking in. Start to cut back. And again, to that point, you may eat a piece of fruit and it doesn't taste as sweet to you when you've had something with that heightened level of sweetness. So we really do have to start to, whether or not someone utilizes the term craving and going towards some of those foods while they're looking for something that is a heightened sweetness level, foods start to taste different when you have been consuming some of the artificial items like the artificial sweeteners. And then one other point I wanted to make, Dr. Fialkow, is, I think in the last few years, when you look at sources of sugar, corn syrup has been one of those ones that really has been tagged to be kind of the culprit and leading to weight gain and obesity. I think we've missed the message here and just need to look at added sugar in general. I see it touted as honey is healthier. It's added sugar. Sugar is sugar. The only unfortunate part is corn syrup is so widely used in food products in the supermarket. It's cheap. It's relatively easy to add in and sweeten an item. And so, yes, in the last few decades, it's been around. It's been the source and culprit. However, nowadays, we really do need to really identify the added sugar in general.
It's fascinating. And again, I'm glad you brought that up, Amy, the concept of corn syrup and how widely disseminated it is. Sugar, table sugar is sucrose, right? It's a molecule of glucose and a molecule of fructose, and it's 50% each. Corn syrup or high fructose corn syrup is 55% fructose, 45 glucose. And you'd think that difference doesn't make a difference. And quite frankly, it probably doesn't. But, in our metabolic clinic that we run, fructose seems to really be a significant component of what drives the insulin resistance. So it's almost like the worst of both worlds, right? You get the glucose, which stimulates the insulin, which we don't want because it can change and deposit fat and all the other inflammatory components, and the fructose, which makes us more insulin resistant. So you need more insulin to get rid of the glucose. So, if you really want to get down to science, these things are not great. So that actually leads to a question from the audience, which I want to get to in the last few minutes. The Angel is, so if we're saying, it's not great, nothing's great, but again, does that mean I should throw away my artificial sweeteners, just forget about it and go to sugar and maybe not high fructose corn syrup with regular sugar? Do you have a hierarchy for the average person?
Yeah,
tough question. I know it's, we can all answer it differently.
Listen, if you heard me earlier, when I was talking about the rats, I get all excited when I talk about research, right? There's plenty of studies that they've done in rats looking at safety, right? But can that be translated over to humans? Obviously not, right? But there have been plenty of studies in humans looking at weight loss. And you mentioned that earlier. And when you take these additives, these sweeteners, you think, you're not getting calories, so I have to lose weight. But you'll be surprised. The data shows that if you lose weight, it's very little. It's a very modest, less than 1 kilo.
You mean from going to artificial sweeteners?
Exactly, from going sucrose to artificial. It's modest, and some studies even show weight gain, which is something that was unexpected. So, like I said, I think moderation is going to be the word with everything, with alcohol, with everything, with anything you eat. Moderation is going to be key. And I do not tell my patients, my diabetic patients, go eat table sugar. That would be bad, right? Yeah. I tell them that if you need that sweet fix, it has to be an artificial sweetener. And just taking into account, we know what sucrose does in terms of obesity and diabetes. and the complications from diabetes. So sometimes you're, the rock and the hard place. What are you going to do? Well, if you need it, then you got to go with the artificial sweetener. And then that's when we have to start talking about which one would be the best one for the patient with all the data that's coming out.
So I think a take-home point, and again, guys, feel free to challenge me on this. We know obesity epidemic in the United States, something we're exporting to the rest of the world. It's a whole nother conversation. But we know obesity is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, and strokes, as well as cancers. We know that, as you said, Angel, switching from sugar drinks, let's say, to artificial sweetened drinks, does not tackle obesity. You're not going to lose the kind of weight that maybe decreases that risk. So maybe it goes back towards just eating the healthier lifestyle, correcting your metabolism, and that will give you the best bang for your buck. That sound like a reasonable conclusion?
It does. And as you know, obesity is associated with increased risk of cancer. Yeah. And patients who are obese have a higher incidence of using artificial sweeteners.
Exactly.
But which came first? Was it the sweetener? Or was it the obesity? That we may never be able to tease out.
And then similarly, if you're going to have a triple Big Mac and a large fries with a Diet Coke, you're not going to expect miracles. So last question has been a great conversation.
But I want to chime
Go ahead,
in,
Amy. I was going to turn to you. Go ahead.
I think it really, for me, is portions. I don't think we've kind of thrown that in because, the dose is very important, literally, as to what people are consuming. And so, like I said, it's perspective. I think that gentleman yesterday was so kind of amazed, like it was his aha moment at how much added sugar was in bread. And for him to not make that connection, I think that's where, like I said, it's the starting point to be able to identify where the added sugar is at or artificial sweeteners. They're sneaking it in. We're not aware that it's there unless we turn it over and look at the ingredient list. And we think we're making the smarter choice. And so once we identify where it's at, begin to cut back and find those other products that you can utilize that may be the better choice.
I don't disagree at all, Amy. And these are conversations Amy and I have quite frankly offline. But we also have to think of satiety and how, a 300-pound person we put on a very low-calorie diet, they're going to be hungry. That's another conversation.
Fiber.
So last question.
Fiber.
Last question. This is to Amy. Why does anyone need artificial sweeteners or diet sodas at all? We commented on a little bit, but just take it home with that answer to that question. Does anyone really need these?
Do we know? I think they've been created for the purpose, like Dr. Alejandro was mentioning. You have a patient in front of you and they don't want to drink water. And so if these items have been created to be able to have as an alternative for something that instead of having just the basic water, right? So a non-sugary, non-caloric drink that allows for them to have this ability to have something that kind of tastes good. And so, like I said, I would start first with what a patient's taking in to be able to have them adjust and be able to start making some of those better choices. But do we need them? No. Bridge the gap, know how much added sugar, know how much artificial sweetener, and really start to work your way into having as minimal amount of both. Even
if people just start paying attention to this one ingredient, the sweeteners, I think they can make big impacts in their health and their lifestyle. So this has been a great conversation, guys. I want to thank you guys for sharing your insights with our audience. And to the viewers, remember, be sure to hit that subscribe button on our channel here to keep up with the latest health and wellness information and tips from our experts. You can also connect with us on all our social media channels. That's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and LinkedIn. And check out our resource blog for the latest news at baptisthealth.net/news. You'll find a link there to all the episodes of the Baptist Health Talk podcast as well. On behalf of everyone at Baptist Health, stay safe, stay healthy, and thanks for watching.
Okay.